Today's episode is a tale of palace intrigue, scheming eunuchs, forged documents, and of murder. That's right, today we are making Yuanxiao, or glutinous rice balls, which are most often associated with the Spring Lantern Festival that closes out the Chinese New Year. But the story of the source of our recipe reads more like Game of Thrones. So today, while I teach you how to make a 17th century version of this well-loved dish, we will travel back to the twilight of the Ming Dynasty for one of the most sensational stories of China's past. This time on Tasting History. Today's recipe comes from the Zhuo Zhong by Liu Ruoyu, a palace eunuch from the late Ming Dynasty. Now, I learned about this document from watching Amanda Tastes, which is a fantastic show that really delves into Chinese cuisine. It's all in Mandarin, but it's still worth watching, even if you don't understand what she's saying. It's just beautiful. And there are, of course, subtitles that you can watch as well. So thank you to her and her channel for the valuable insight into this recipe. Also, a huge thank you to Tasting History viewer Roy Chan for helping me with a lot of the translations, really helping me with the history research, and for being so patient as he tried to teach me how to pronounce all of this Mandarin. I didn't get most of it, but I'm going to try my best. The cooking method uses glutinous rice that has been ground into a fine powder. The filling comprises the flesh of walnuts and white sugar. Water is sprinkled on the filling, and the balls are rolled around in flour to form them. They are as big as walnuts. This is the same as what the people of the Jiangnan region call Tangyuan. Now, Liu doesn't actually give us the name of the dish, he only tells us what people in the south call the dish. So we can extrapolate that it is Yuanxiao, which is still served at the end of the Chinese New Year. Today they're made with all sorts of fillings, but the most common are black sesame seeds, red bean paste, or peanut butter. And the really only difference between the northern version and the southern version are how they're actually made. The ingredients tend to stay the same, but in the north, they're done as Liu describes, and they're going to be rolled in rice flour to build up the outside, whereas in the south, the rice flour is actually made into a paste and wrapped around the filling. There's actually a really great story about the two names. It might not be true, but it's just too good not to share. So the first president of China in the early 20th century was a man named Yuanxiao, and he really hated the name Yuanxiao because, just like in English, there are homonyms. And so Yuanxiao can refer to this food or the festival, but it can also mean remove Yuan, who was him, as in remove him from office. So he really preferred people use the southern term rather than the northern. But regardless of what you call them, here is what you'll need to make them. 1 1/4 cup, or about 140 grams of walnuts, 1/2 cup or 100 grams of sugar, 4 tablespoons or 57 grams melted lard or melted butter, 4 cups or 450 grams of glutinous rice flour, and some water. Now, in her video, Amanda actually talks about how often in the Ming Dynasty they would have used rose petals as flavoring for things like this, and in her video she makes a wonderful rose petal jam. So if you want to, I'll link to that video and you can go watch her make it and maybe put some rose flavoring in these for yourself. I'm going to just follow the recipe as is and keep to just the nuts and the sugar. Now, if you have kids at home, I really encourage you to make this recipe with them because the process of making them is actually a lot of fun, and most of it's kid-friendly. Maybe not the boiling, and maybe not this very first part, but everything in the middle. So first, heat a pan over medium heat and toss your walnuts in to give them a little toasting. You want to make sure to move them around fairly regularly because if they stay in one place too long, they can burn. Once they're lightly toasted, just browned a little bit, take them out and let them cool. Once they're cool, you want to crush them up almost to a powder. You can start with your hands, just making them into small pieces, but then you can either use a mortar and pestle, but I really suggest just using a blender if you have it, or a food processor rather. It's going to save you a lot of time. Now, if you don't get the nuts all the way to a powder, that's okay. They do need to be fairly fine though, because we're going to be making a paste of sorts with this, and if they're big chunks, it's just not going to hold together. Now put the nuts into a medium bowl and add your sugar and your melted lard or butter, and mix until you have a nice paste. And that's all you need to do for the filling. It's way, way easy, but it's gonna be almost impossible to form these into little balls right now. So it's best if you put it either in the freezer for about 15 minutes or in the fridge for an hour or two, just so the fat can harden up a little bit. It's gonna make it a lot easier to roll. Once the filling is nice and firm, take a piece and form it into a ball. Now, according to the original recipe, after adding the flour, these are supposed to be about the size of a walnut. So you want the filling to be quite a bit smaller than that, just bite size. So once you get the filling formed into little balls, I got about a dozen out of this, it's time to start the laborious but fun process of adding the flour to them. I think this is the part that the kids are gonna like because I really had a great time doing it, and I tend to like what kids like, so yeah. So the original document says to sprinkle water on the filling and then roll it in the flour, but recipes back then sometimes not terribly great, as we know, so I'm going to follow the modern method because sprinkling didn't work. The modern method, you dip them in water, and it worked. So you'll need 2 large bowls, and to make life a little easier, it's good if you have either a slotted spoon or a strainer. Then fill one bowl with water, and fill the other with your glutinous rice flour. Then place the balls in the flour and roll them around until they are well covered. Now on the streets in China, they make these, and they have these huge round things that have just a little bit of flour on the bottom, and they swirl them around. So if you have one of those, way cool, it looks like a lot of fun. I didn't, so I did it in a bowl, but gosh, if you have one of those big round things, use that. Once they're covered in the flour, either place them into the water like I did, or if you have a strainer, probably easier. I actually forgot to use a strainer, but the easiest thing is gonna be to put the balls in the strainer and then dip it in the water, and then you can just get it out. Otherwise, I had to use a slotted spoon, which worked just fine. Now you might think, well, this is going to wash off all of the rice flour, and it seems like it, but it's so sticky that a little bit stays on there. And we're gonna do this 7 times. Maybe more if you need it, but 7 was enough for me. 7 times, building up the outside a little bit at a time. So once you take them out of the water, put them back in the rice flour and roll them around again, and then back in the water they go. Like I said, 7 times. And by that 7th time, you should have a nice coating of rice flour around the filling. You shouldn't be able to see the filling at all. So it's gonna take a little while, but that's great, because that means it's time for history. First, our cast of characters. Our villain, Wei Zhongxian, or Wei for short. His scheming sidekicks, Madame Ke and Li Yongchen. The dim-witted Tianqi Emperor and the less dim-witted Chongzhen Emperor. And our hero and author of our recipe, Liu Ruoyu, or Liu for short. Now let us begin our story where so many wonderful stories begin, with an evil and scheming eunuch, Wei Zhongxian. So something to know about Chinese history is that eunuchs were an incredibly important part of imperial life. They were often the most powerful, trusted, or mistrusted people serving the emperor. In fact, when the emperor put a call out that he would need eunuchs, thousands of men would have themselves castrated in the hope that they could then go serve the emperor. Unfortunately, they usually didn't need that many, so, a lot of people didn't get the job. It's kind of like that time that I got a really short buzz cut for an audition and still didn't get the part. It's just a little more permanent, but it hurts nonetheless. And that's what happened with Wei Zhongxian. He had himself castrated to enter imperial life, though there are stories of the reason that he did it was actually to get away from gambling debts. So, not a very auspicious start. But regardless of why he did it, he did pretty well for himself, getting to be in the inner circle of the imperial family, and even becoming a sort of father figure to Zhuo, who at the tender age of 15 became the Tianqi Emperor. And that's when things took a bit of a turn for the worse than the self-castration even, because he and the emperor's wet nurse, Madame Ke, ended up taking over the court, and not in the most pleasant of ways. Madame Ke imprisoned the emperor's concubines and starved them to death, and Wei forced one of the emperor's closest advisors to commit suicide. Then the pair made sure to keep the emperor illiterate, keeping him busy with things like hunting and woodworking rather than matters of state, while they took over control of the government. Wei installed all of the most loyal eunuchs, loyal to him, into high positions of power, and he created a eunuch private guard. He also took over the Eastern Depot, which was kind of a secret police with inquisitorial powers based in the Forbidden City. Anyone who dared stand up to Wei was put on trial and almost always found guilty and executed, or sometimes they were just beaten to death because who has time for a trial? Then, with the help of eunuch groups with cool names like the 5 Tigers and the 10 Dogs, he had all of the academies around the kingdom shut down, and those were the places that fostered free thinking and political discussion. Didn't want any of that. Instead, he endorsed people building shrines to him. Good times. It's in this climate that the hero of our story, Liu, finds himself rising in the ranks of the palace eunuchs. See, at the age of 16, Liu had had a strange dream. That's all that we know, just a strange dream that caused him to castrate himself, or have himself castrated, it's unclear, so he could enter palace life. I've never had a dream that has caused me to do something so dramatic, but, you know, teenagers. Anyway, in his early years at the palace, his main focus of study was the search for immortality. Immortal Eunuch, a new fragrance by Calvin Klein. And while he would never achieve immortality in the way that he thought, he would achieve it through his writings. Because of Liu's upbringing in a military family, he had something that very few eunuchs had: literacy. And it was this facility with calligraphy that got him to where he was, but it also stirred the ire of some jealous people, including Wei Zhongxian himself. Liu ended up being demoted to work in the stables, and that's when he gave himself the moniker Ruoyu, which means the dumb, because he figured staying silent and not showing off too much was probably a better way to get ahead. And it did serve him better, because a few years later, Wei recalled him to put him under the tutelage of his right-hand man, Li Yongzhen, and that is where poor Liu really made his fateful mistake. See, it seems that Li Yongzhen had come into possession of a number of documents that had the emperor's seal on them, but that's all that they had on them. Nothing else. They were blank. It would be like having a bunch of letterhead from the White House with the president's signature on it, and nothing else. You could fill in the blanks however you wanted. All the better for Wei to govern without the emperor's consent. And Liu knew this and probably helped to fill out some of these documents because he was so good at writing. And that's all hunky-dory until the emperor dies a few years later and a new and a little bit smarter emperor takes the throne. After a few months on the throne, the new Chongzhen emperor found Wei guilty of numerous crimes and banished him. But because Wei had become so powerful, I mean, this eunuch kind of ruled the kingdom, the emperor thought, you know what, you could probably stir a revolt against me, so how about come back to the Forbidden City and I'm going to imprison you. Wei was not having that, so instead he committed suicide and his body was mutilated and put out on display by the emperor. Madame Ke was whipped to death and Li Yongzhen was executed, and Liu was supposed to be executed as well. But for some reason, he ended up just going to prison, and he was there for at least 12 years while he wrote the Zhuo Zhengzhi. The first part of the document is written as sort of a mea culpa, kind of a, oh my gosh, how could I be naive? I didn't know what was going on, you guys. Misunderstanding. Even though he probably did know what was going on because he was a really smart guy, but, you know, he got to write his story, so he's the hero. But it's the rest of the document that really gave Liu Ruoyu his immortality. Emulating the style of Sima Qian, author of the Shiji and father of Chinese history, Liu documented life in the Forbidden City like few others could, or few others ever did. Daily rituals, clothing, ceremonies, and of course recipes, just like our glutinous rice balls, which should be all formed and ready to boil. So once the balls are all covered in flour, go ahead and put a large pot of water on the stove and set it to boiling. Then put the balls in 5 or 6 at a time depending on the size of your pot. They're going to swell up just a little bit, so make sure to have plenty of room. Leave them boiling until they float up to the top. It takes about 2 or 3 minutes. Then add a cup of cold water to the hot water, which will help keep the skin intact. The balls will sink down just a bit and the water will probably stop boiling, so let them go for another couple minutes until the water boils again and the balls float to the top. At this point, you can take them out and they're ready to eat. It's good practice to put a little bit of the water in with the balls, especially if you're not going to eat them right away, just so they don't dry out. And there are our Yuanxiao. I think they're so cool looking. They kind of puff up a little bit. The southern version, where they're wrapped, they tend to be much smoother, but I kind of like the puffiness of these. I'm sure they're both very good, and they should probably taste pretty much the same. I'm using chopsticks to pick mine up because they're very, very sticky. I tried with my fingers and my fingers just kind of got stuck in with the balls. So if you have chopsticks, great. If not, use a fork. That was so fun. What a wonderful little dish. I love it. The kids are gonna love these. The sticky rice, they are sticky. Even inside my mouth, it's like, it's gooey and wonderful, and they're definitely eat them warm. You know, eat them right away. Absolutely fantastic. So the flavor's wonderful. You know, I mean, it's you can't really taste the rice, so it's really walnuts and sugar. What's not to like? But what's fun is the texture. That outside, they're really sticky. My mouth is like, The outside has this sort of skin, like I mentioned, that you don't want to break because it's fun to break it with your teeth. There's some give to it, and then it just kind of snaps. And then the inside is so different because it's kind of smooth, but it's also a little gritty because of the sugar and the nuts and everything. I think if you use some of the more modern inserts, some of the more modern fillings, they're going to ooze more. This is not really oozing. It's warm and it's soft, but it's not like flowing out. I hate that I've just said ooze so many times because that's kind of gross. Whether you have kids or not, you gotta make these. They're so much fun to make. They're so much fun to eat. They're delicious. I need to find a good Chinese restaurant around here who has more fillings because I want to try all the different kinds. Yeah, wonderful. Now, if you haven't subscribed already, please do so I can see you next time on Tasting History.